All right, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Dominik, and we're going to talk about how to move your project to TypeScript. I'm so sorry for that. It seems like I'm still in the stream, and so I was hearing my echo. All right, thanks again for joining. My name is Dominik. I work as a developer evangelist at a company called Twilio. If you haven't heard of Twilio, we're a cloud communications platform that has a bunch of APIs to use different means of communication. If you have questions, my colleague Phil Nash hangs out in the chat, so he can help you out with that. And you can find me anywhere on the internet under Kundel. So to set everyone onto the same page, if you've never heard of TypeScript, TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. So that basically means that any valid JavaScript is valid TypeScript. And if you take one thing away from this talk, that's that. TypeScript is just a superset of JavaScript, which means if you're writing valid JavaScript today, you're writing TypeScript. So as much as like a lot of people have concerns about TypeScript and like having to learn a new language, you already know a lot of TypeScript. Basically, the only thing TypeScript adds to that is a static type system that will allow you to kind of tell the language what is actually expected of a variable. So you're expecting this to be a string or a number rather than evaluating that during runtime. And then based on top of that language, TypeScript is also a compiler and a language server. So that just means that given that additional information, the compiler and the language service can do certain assumptions and help you out on your day-to-day job, or throw errors if you're doing things that you're not intending to, rather than encountering those during runtime. So why would you use TypeScript? So the three core arguments that you typically hear from people using TypeScript is that it allows you to write safer code, that it is a better user and developer experience, and that it enables you to do faster and easier refactoring because it sort of understands your project better than JavaScript by itself. And we'll see all of these in action in some way or another today. But one example that I want to give you, just to kind of put everyone onto the same page, is the example of Webpack. Because we have this connotation that you have to write your entire project in TypeScript, you have to learn this new language. And that's not actually the case. So Webpack uses TypeScript in their project, but their entire project is written in JavaScript. And they introduced TypeScript back in 2018 as just a tool that sort of works like a really smart linter. And when they put TypeScript into the project, they actually found a lot of different bugs that they hadn't encountered before, even though they had a heavily tested code base. And that is because TypeScript can understand a lot of the things and how they fit together before you actually execute it during runtime. And so today I want to show you how you can leverage TypeScript the way you want to. And if that means you don't want to leverage TypeScript at all, that's okay. I hope you still stay on the talk to get a better idea of what you might be able to do if you decide to use it. And most importantly, I want to show you how you can do that at your own pace. I understand that like people can't just move their entire project overnight to another programming language, but I want to show you that you can leverage TypeScript step by step. And if you feel like this is the right amount of stuff that TypeScript helps you, then that's where you can stop and you're good. And you don't have to like go hardcore into TypeScript on day one. But that's basically where I'm going to stop using the slides, and let's instead dive into a couple of different code things here. So I have a JavaScript project going on here that is essentially an Express app. The only difference is that I broke it down into two different files here. So I have an index file and I have a data file that just exposes a route. And that's just purely to show you a couple of different concepts. And the first thing I want to show you is actually nothing that has to do with us installing TypeScript. It's something that is related to the editor. So I'm using VS Code, which is written in TypeScript, but it also ships with the TypeScript language server by default. And the neat thing is, since TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript, it can understand the JavaScript language. It can understand JavaScript. So if we're actually going here and hovering over anything here, we can actually see that things are being kind of evaluated with additional information, like this port is of type string or 3000. And so that already gives us a lot of additional information here. But we can take this one further. So I have a configuration enabled here that will automatically evaluate any of my JavaScript against against the TypeScript compiler. So you can see here we're getting an error while I'm writing the JavaScript that says, hey, port can't be constant. So I'm changing this to let, and I'll still get an error, but now it says that, hey, the left side of this arithmetic operation is not of type any, number, big int, or an enum. And that's because it can be a string, and so we can't actually subtract 1 from that. The reason why I'm getting this is because I have a setting enabled in my VS Code called JavaScript implicit project config check.js. And that will just tell me, hey, run every JavaScript code that I'm writing through the TypeScript compiler. I have all of these settings in a blog post that I'll share with you afterwards. So if you want to take that, you can check that out later. This also works in other code editors. You don't have to switch to VS Code for that, but you have to install the respective TypeScript language server extensions that exist for different code editors. All right, so now that we have that, let's actually get into the first step of moving your project to TypeScript, and that is installing the TypeScript compiler. So we can do that via npm or yarn, and I'll install it as a def dependency here to my project. So I recommend using a def dependency here rather than a global, because that way you can have different versions of TypeScript for different projects, and that just makes it easier adopting new features, for example. So now that we have that, the other thing that I'll do is I'll execute the TypeScript compiler called TSC with the --init flag, and that will just generate a basic tsconfig file for me. This is really cool because while you could create that file from scratch, if you run this init command, it will actually give you every single option that is available with some comments explaining what they are and what the options are. So you don't actually have to dive into the docs to understand all the different documentation, configuration values. The first thing I'll turn off here is the strict mode. The reason why you want to turn this off if you're migrating an existing project is that's typically where people immediately get frustrated, because if you turn strict mode on, TypeScript will do its best to be as strict as possible. And you don't want to do that if you're just getting started and you want to dip your toes into it. So I'm turning it off. We can later go and sort of enable any of these flags step by step, or we can enable strict, which will implicitly turn all of these different ones on. The other thing we'll do is we'll turn this to ESNext, which will just tell TypeScript that the output that we are generating should be ESNext, which just means don't touch it. Or touch it as little as possible, which we'll see in a second what that means. And then the other thing we'll turn on is allow.js. That will tell the compiler if you're encountering any JavaScript, actually run that through the TypeScript compiler as well. We'll turn on the out directory and tell it that any output we want to put into a dist folder. And we'll turn on the root directory here to say that all of my code that it should take into consideration is in the source folder. So I save this, and then the only other configuration that we have down here is ES module interop true, which we'll come to in a minute. So now that we have all of that, let me run the compiler. But for that, we actually need to add that as a task here. So I'm going to create a new build script here. And one thing that while we're here that we should do is we should change the main entry point to dist index.js now, because that will allow us to execute that code afterwards against the code that was compiled. So we get a dist folder here now, and we'll see the code actually didn't really change. The only thing that disappeared are the empty lines, and that's fine by me. So like that's the only thing that was removed. Otherwise, TypeScript didn't change our code. And if we run npm start, our server is still running, so that's great. But if we would go back here and we would change this to ES5, and we rerun the compiler here, we'll see the code still works, but now if we go into the output here, we can see that it changed the const to vars, and it removed the destructuring and other things to make this ES5 compatible. So if you don't want to actually set up Babel and other things, and you just want it down transpiled to like a more compatible version for your environment, you can use TypeScript for a lot of these things. However, Babel is much more granular in terms of what you can use. And those two also can collaborate with each other. All right, so we have all of that. And that means that we now have actually set up our our tool chain to be able to write TypeScript. But we're still in JavaScript. We didn't do any changes actually, except that we can now down transpile if we want to. The next step that we want to do is we want to introduce type checks. And that's where we activate the check.js flag. So the check.js flag does the same thing that I've been using in my code editor just now for this project. But if we're going into index.js, we'll see 3 errors here. All of these 3 have one thing in common. Those are all 3 things that are from Node.js. And while TypeScript is aware of all the things that the browser has, it doesn't know by default what Node.js has. And so we need to actually inform it about how to do that. If we're hovering over the process here, we can actually see TypeScript giving us a hint that we run npm install add types node, and now all of these error messages are gone. And that's because we installed some additional types for TypeScript to tell them about what's available in Node.js. So now that we have all of that, we actually enabled the type checking. So again, we can go here, we can do things like -1, and do the let here, run the build, and we will now in our build pipeline get an error that that's not possible. Versus traditionally, we would hit this either in unit tests or we would hit this in while running our code. All right, so we have all of that, but we're still in JavaScript. As you can see, we didn't do any changes to our source code. Everything still works the same way, but we're now getting additional knowledge. And in fact, that is how Webpack uses it. Webpack does one difference, which is they're actually using the no emit flag here, which instead of outputting JavaScript and like running it through the compiler for that, it only uses the type checking functionality and doesn't actually output anything new. And so this is super helpful if you just want to run TypeScript as sort of like a smart linter. And you can combine this with JS doc comments. So if you have a function that you want to type, but you don't want to write TypeScript, if you are already writing JS doc, then that's great. TypeScript understands JS doc comments and can do that understanding. Okay, so we have all of this. Now it's time to actually move our project step by step to TypeScript. So I'm going to rename this file to TS. And TypeScript uses ES module syntax instead of common JS syntax. So we need to switch this to an import statement and we also need to change the exports here to do export default. We'll save this and we'll let's change this up there back to ES next to showcase better what's happening. And then we run the build. And we'll go into the run this first, and we'll see we're getting an error. And that's because if we're going to the data here, we'll see as much as like it basically compiled it back to what it was before, there's one critical difference. It's not module.exports equals routes anymore. It's exports.default equals routes. And that's by design because that's how ES modules are actually spec'd. If you have a default export, it technically exports it on the default property. But now, since we're mixing JavaScript and TypeScript here, and some modules are written like this, we need to fix that for this specific import. The easiest way to do that is to just reassign that value when we're importing. If we rebuild, we should now be able to start this again, and the server is working again. So we fixed that, and now this file is TypeScript. Again, we didn't actually add anything. If you're already using ES module syntax instead of common JS, you could have just left this file like this and it would have stayed valid TypeScript. So that's how we can move that file over. Let's do the same thing on the index file here. So I'm going to rename that file. Let's hide the terminal. I'm again changing all of the import here to be ES module syntax. And now we need to change that back to the import. So we have that. We can save. We can rerun our build. And our code should still work. Awesome. So our server's still starting. We moved both files to TypeScript. And now you can do this step by step throughout your code base to move slowly new existing files to TypeScript while writing new files directly in TypeScript. The thing though is we're not actually using TypeScript to its best of its ability. Again, like this is basically just JavaScript. If we're hovering over the app variable here, for example, this is of type any, which means TypeScript can't offer us things like autocomplete, for example, to actually tell us what the options here are. But let's actually do this by turning on the thing that people are most concerned about, and that's by turning on the strict flag. So let's have the compiler be strict about everything. And this is where we see another error, because TypeScript now tells us that I don't know about express. They're fine with log symbols, and that's because log symbols is written in TypeScript or ships their own definitions directly with the module. Express is written in JavaScript and doesn't ship any definitions, so we need to install those separately. There's a project called @types, which is a community project called Definitely Type that maintains a bunch of types for libraries. So we're installing that, our error goes away, and now we can hover over this and we see that we're actually getting the app is of type express here, which means that now we can go and get better autocomplete for everything. Now that we have that, let's actually write some stricter TypeScript. So right now these are both defined, but that's not because we gave them types, but that's because TypeScript is smart enough to know that the second argument here has to have a certain structure of function signature. And so it just implies that. But we can make this more specific. So we know that the first thing is a request object. And we know the second one is a response object. Now we need to put in the response class here, and there's a couple of different types that we could pull in. The one I'm pulling in is from Express serve static core, which is a dependency of Express. And the reason why I'm using that one is because we can actually type what this argument should be, which is super cool because that means we can better type what the response of our API would be. So I'm going to create a type here called payload. And this is the first time we're adding TypeScript specific types here. And we're specifying that hello should be of type world. And then we put that in here, save that. And now we can see that everything is fine. But the moment I change this on either side, let's change it here to Earth, we're getting an error that, hey, Earth is not assignable to world. So we need to change that. We could, for example, loosen the types here and say, hey, like really, as long as this is a string, that's fine. But now if we would change this to a number, we're getting again an error here. So now we can actually use that to very clearly define sort of our API contract, for example. So if we're changing this back to hello, hello, this works now. And there's a lot of additional things that you can start doing now to make this more and more sort of bulletproof by specifying types. But in a lot of cases, you don't want to be like, you don't have to be overly expressive. So for example, here, because this is a const, it automatically knows that this is of type express. This one automatically knows it's of type string or number. So you don't have to type all of these. You could totally go here and specify like express, but we don't have to do that. Anyways, that's the basics of how you can slowly move over and then keep iterating on this. I know I showed a lot of different things, so I ended up writing this up into a blog post. It sort of goes again step by step through this thing, and that you can just keep at the back of your hand if you want to transition your own project over to TypeScript. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll hang around in the Twitch chat for a bit. And otherwise, feel free to send me an email, send me a message on Twitter. And thank you so much for hanging out, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.